Hi, this is Marielle Heller from The Hollywood Reporter, and I'm in studio today with Richard E. Grant and Marielle Heller. Hi.
Hi.
We are here to talk about Can You Ever Forgive Me? So, Marielle, this is a completely un-Hollywood type movie. What made you want to tell this story?
Probably that's part of what made me want to tell this story. I liked that it was a movie that was not about the type of woman that we really get to see on screen, a 51-year-old cat lady with lesbian who cares more about her intelligence than her looks. She's just not the type of character we see on screen, and she also is a bit of an asshole. And I liked that. I feel like we get to see these really interesting men who are really cranky, and we like them despite that. You know, nobody asks if Tony Soprano is likable, but we tend to do that with our female characters in ways that bums me out. So I just found her inspiring, and then the thing that really connected me was this relationship between these two misfits who, both for different reasons, have nobody in their lives. Richard plays Jack Hawke, who is a gay man who is living in the midst of the AIDS crisis, and all of his friends are dead, essentially, and he's found himself pretty alone with nowhere to go. And Lee, Melissa McCarthy's character, has sort of pushed everybody away in her life.
Right.
And in this sort of unlikely pairing, the two of them find each other, and it's really a bit of a platonic love story between the two of them.
Richard, how did you go about bringing Jack Hawke back to life?
Obviously, the screenplay is the roadmap for everything, and Melissa McCarthy and Marielle's take on everything was so real and true and unsentimental, and also underpinned by an enormous compassion. So that created the perfect environment in which to play these parts, or play my part. And the only addition that I asked for was that I knew from the book that he had this little stubby cigarette holder, and I asked if I could have that as a prop, because I thought that a sort of Peter O'Toole-like affectation that this guy had of going around, trotting around the Greenwich Village at that time with a cigarette holder, gave some indication of how he saw himself. So that was a prop that I hung on to.
Yes,
he's had brilliant costumes.
He's a real scoundrel, isn't he?
Yes, yeah.
They both are. They're scoundrels together. They're little rascals who make a lot of trouble together, and that's what's the fun of the movie, is watching them get into trouble.
Nobody gets hurt. Some people lose some money, but they grift and scam their way around and have a good time while doing it.
Yeah. How did you create that chemistry between yourself and Melissa McCarthy?
Well,
it's very hard because they hated each other.
Yeah, it was very hard because she's a very, very difficult person, as I'm sure you know, and she's ungenerous and unkind and never knew her lines and was always late for work and hated me. But I acted the best way that I could through that, and Mari was very diplomatic.
I would just hug you at the end of the day and say it's
I'm
okay.
still in therapy for it.
Yeah.
I'm recovering from the McCarthy sort of tsunami of hatred that I encountered. No, I absolutely worshipped her. And it happened within literally 3 seconds. We met on a Friday and we started shooting on the Monday. And Mari mercifully allowed us to have a couple of hours rehearsal time just to go through the script and what the intentions were. And it was so clear where she was coming from. And that because I'd seen all her screen work, I'd never seen Melissa in the theatre. So I wasn't sure at what level this was going to be a Melissa McCarthy vehicle or not, because I didn't know her. I'd never met anybody before. So there's always that risk of thinking, at what level are you coming in as the sidekick support part in that? But she was so
We were a team.
Yeah, we were a team
it was
right
a
from the get-go.
total fun group team feeling that we were making the same movie.
Yeah.
And I was talking about this the other day. Even though we didn't get to do a lot of rehearsal, and I would have loved to do more rehearsal before we started, we did make sure on every day before we did a scene, we had a private rehearsal where we kicked all the crew out, and we had enough time to really explore the deeper parts of what those relationships were. And you guys were able to really let me know how things were feeling, and we could adjust things, and we at least protected this little bit of rehearsal time for each scene before we would shoot, which I think lent to their amazing chemistry on screen, which was
And it's an extraordinary testament to Marielle, because the shoot was 28 days, which is, it's a very short amount of time, even though most of the scenes were between a maximum 2 or 3 people. But we never felt rushed, and because she wears her authority so lightly, and is so compassionate and kind, you always felt that there was time for something. And that, it's such a smart thing to do, because it sounds so obvious, because it meant that that in giving us that private time at the beginning, with the crew being out of the door, meant that there was no time wasted in trying to find out what you were doing with everybody around, technically getting through the day, which so often happens where people go, we don't need to rehearse, and then you go, but you don't really know what is happening in the scene. So, that's all entirely due to our director here. Yeah. So I'm blowing major smoke.
Yeah, Richard, you've been on many kinds of sets.
Yes, because I'm so old.
How was this set different? Yes.
What I was saying is I'd been on the Logan movie, the Wolverine, which is a 300-strong crew of basically men who were, they had arms thicker than my thighs stuck together.
Just like me.
Yeah. So there was machinery and guns and cranes and all that stuff that goes on. And then coming to this movie, which was co-written, directed by, starring, produced by, and crewed by predominantly women, the feeling of being, it sounds such a cliche, but of being nurtured and cared for and sort of hovercrafted by people's kindness is something that was unique, and I would run 1,000 miles a day to go and do that again. It was absolutely amazing, and for an actor, that's what you hope you're going to have in a working environment.
Well, I believe that's how you get the types of performances we got in this movie, was creating the space and the work to be able to let them actually deliver.
The award goes to
Mari, how hard is it to create New York City circa the 90s?
It's a little tricky, but it's not that hard. There's a lot of New York that hasn't changed and that looks the same. I mean, you're avoiding city bikes and, certain new buildings and things like that.
You have to put phone boxes on the corners of streets.
We were literally, tipping big couches to cover up things that we couldn't see, like electronic. Actually, we had a funny day where we had set dressing on the street, which was just a giant couch that was tipped up on its side that was supposed to block something we really couldn't see, and then someone stole it because they thought it was trash on the street. And by the time we went to shoot the scene, we were like, where's our set dressing? We're like, oh, that's what happens in New York. You put a couch out, it's gone in 5 minutes. But for the most part, we were finding beautiful bookstores and places that still exist, and it was about discovering all of these places that are still these gems from a different era of New York.
And the Julius Bar, the oldest gay bar in Manhattan,
yes.
They very generously allowed us to shoot there.
Yes.
And they didn't
and
pass
it's
judgment.
where Lee really drank.
Yeah.
And a lot of the places we were Lee's real hangout spots, the bars, the bookstores, and the bartender there knew Lee and remembered her kind of fondly.
And we had that invisible thing called luck on a movie, where there was snow outside the Julius Bar one day and then spring sunshine on another day.
Yes, and we only shot there for 2 days.
Just grabbed it. So it was really fortunate.
Marielle, what do you think is the overarching lesson of Lee's life?
I think I don't really believe in morals for movies, if I'm being honest. I just don't think the purpose of us telling these stories is to tell people how to live their lives, but I hope that people watching the movie feel a little closer to humanity and to other people. I like telling stories about people who sort of live in the gray zone ethically and morally and are sort of push our boundaries of what we think of when we think of people who we see on screen. I find Lee to be just hilarious and interesting and fascinating to watch, and the reason she's fascinating to watch is because she is not a morally clean person. I think seeing artists who are struggling and trying to figure out how to get by in a city is something a lot of us can relate to. Every artist, I think, can relate to, but I think most people can relate to also. What would it be if you're 51 and you wake up and the world tells you you're obsolete? What would you do? So if watching that story makes us feel a little closer or a little more compassionate toward other people in our lives, or the woman who lives across the hall from you or who you pass on the street, I think that's a nice outcome of it, but I try to not pass too much moral judgment on my characters.
Right. That's probably a good idea because it speaks to realism.
Yes.
Realistically, we walk around all day and we don't get judged morally.
No, and I don't think I believe that humanity is good or bad. I have this conversation with my 3-year-old where he asks me about bad guys all the time, and I say there's not really bad guys. There's people who are hurt. There are people who are hurting, but I just don't think I believe in that when I think about humanity.
Do either of you have nostalgia for this time period, kind of pre-cell phone?
Oh yeah.
When bookstores were important. I mean, this is really a
Yeah.
very much a time capsule that I think we all thought wouldn't be a time capsule.
Well, the
so
country
quickly.
I grew up in Southeast Africa, had no television until I was 22 years old. So books were that was my modus operandi to understand the world, and movies.
Yeah.
So, the silhouette of our age now, where everybody is literally glued at all times, even at dinners in restaurants, you see people not talking to each other. So I do feel genuine nostalgia for people having a conversation like we're having now, and that it's not interrupted by, I've just got to...
I
this
don't
is
even
more
know how to
important.
make a movie where in the age of cell phones. I just finished filming my third movie. My first movie was set in 1976. This was set in 1991. My next one is in 98, and I made the call nobody could have a cell phone because it's right on the cusp there,
Yeah.
but because it's the antithesis of drama.
Yeah.
To have a cell phone, it's the antithesis of human interaction. I feel like cell phones just ruin movies. So I don't know. I'm just going to keep making movies that are set before 1998, so I never have to deal with it.
Richard, what was your best day on set?
The best day was the day that we had to clean the cat detritus, for want of a better word, cat shite from underneath Lee's bed, which was all plasticine, was hilarious. We found it very difficult to keep a straight face. Lavatory paper stuck up each nostril. But weirdly, the day that was the most poignant and difficult for us to do, but also the most rewarding, was the final scene that my character Jack Hawke has with Lee Israel, because
Yes.
they've been estranged for some months, and she then has to very reluctantly, in order to get permission to write her book, which is the title of the movie, has to ask his permission to, can I write our story, which is a very big ask on her part, because she doesn't think that she needs anybody at all. So, and it was also the penultimate scene that we shot, and we'd had such an intense experience making this movie together that you kind of fall in love with the people that you're working with. Mm-hmm. So saying goodbye to the characters and saying goodbye within the scene and knowing that my character was dying was a kind of triple whammy. It felt like, to me, all those scenes at the end of E.T. where he says goodbye once, and then you think you've just got over that, and then he revives, and then you say goodbye about 5 times, so you're wiped out by the end of it.
And you guys were so fantastic in that scene. Your performance in that scene is
thank you.
so touching. And it was a really fun scene to shoot, because as much as you guys are saying goodbye, and as sad as it is, it's also wicked and morbid, and the humor in the scene is what makes it so touching, because it's so not sentimental.
Completely.
It's just the two of you.
Exactly.
As you are, not having changed all that much.
Unvarnished.
Yeah.
Uncensored.
Uncensored, yes.
Is it rewarding to bring back a person in a performance that might have otherwise been forgotten by time?
Yeah, and especially in the case of the character I played, Jack Hawke, because I know that in real life he was 47 when he died, so much younger than me, and was from Portland in Oregon. There were no photographs of him. We found no people that knew him, so he had no survivors. And we made the assumption, true or false, that his family he'd either become estranged from them or had been abandoned by them. And that whole generation of men, and I knew, and I worked with many actors in the early 90s who are no longer with us. So in some way, it's a kind of homage to that generation of men that have gone, that were wiped out by that plague.
It was so important that we set a story that was about 2 queer characters in 1991 in New York. It had to be in the midst of the AIDS crisis.
Yeah.
It would have been disingenuous to tell their story without that being the context in which they lived.
And yet you only know that right at the end of the movie. It's
There's
never
little
made
hints.
a deal of.
Yeah, no, it's never hit over the head, but
Yeah.
but it's the truth of their context.
Yeah.
And for a lot of lesbians and gay men, this moment in time was when those communities kind of came together. A lot of lesbians were taking care of dying gay men, and those communities, which had been so separate, were sort of coming together. So in some way, Lee and Jack coming together felt like a bit of a beautiful symbolic love that we were seeing between those communities too.
And I feel this is a question that you might be asked a lot, but do you think that Lee would enjoy this movie?
We were asked that. Well, Melissa asked that of a man who knew Lee when we were sitting at a bar, and she said, "Do you think Lee would be happy about a movie being made about her life?" And his response was, "Happy wasn't really Lee's thing, but she would be excited for the attention on her work." I think that feels about right.
I'd like to know where the letters are that she forged.
We have copies of a lot of them. She kept carbon copies of a lot of them.
Okay, so are those carbon copies worth something?
Well, I'm sure they are, but I also think there are more floating out there than we possibly know.
Yeah.
People keep bringing up to me, I have this suspicious letter. It's I think there are definitely still letters of hers floating around, and which is what we tried to allude to in the very final scene of the movie, that, like, they're still out there.
Still out there.
2 of them ended up in the collected letters of Noel Coward, which the preeminent historians of Noel Coward didn't catch that they were her letters until the second printing.
That is smart.
She was good.
She was good.
She was
Really
real
good.
good.
She was a talent.
Well, Marielle Heller, Richard E. Grant, thank you so much for being here. The movie is Can You Ever Forgive Me?
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.